This video is gonna piss off some of you, but I hope objectively be useful for most of you. Throughout the course of preparing this review, I changed my own thoughts on the M1 Pro and the M1 Max chips, which I'll share with you toward the end of the video. It might change your mind too, and if you're on the fence or confused about either, this video should help answer any questions you may be having. Hi everybody, foXnoMad here, and today I want to help you travel smarter with my review of the M1 Pro 16-inch MacBook Pro based on real-world use. This video is going to be most relevant to you if you're new to M1 or if you're thinking of upgrading from a relatively recent Intel machine. What those differences are, and whether or not you're going to see and feel that upgrade on a day-to-day basis compared to the machine you might be using now. I want to focus especially on video editors, developers, and those of you who use virtual machines on a regular basis, because that's part of my regular workflow. This review isn't going to be a comprehensive breakdown of benchmarks. There are plenty of those out there, but as someone who came from a 2019 i9 with 32 gigabytes of RAM, here's how big of a leap the M1 Pro is and isn't. The physical design of the new M1 MacBook Pro is a major step backward from the 2019 i9. And that's not a bad thing since we're jumping back to pre-2016 when MacBook Pros were a little thicker. The M1 Pro has gained a little pandemic weight, but has returned MagSafe, which is this magnetic charge connector, so if you accidentally trip the power cord, it won't send your expensive laptop flying off a desk. We also get back some very useful ports. First, the SD card slot. As someone who shoots a lot of videos, being able to dump my SD card right onto my MacBook Pro is a frequent and very useful feature to have. Although I can plug in my Sony a7C to transfer the video files, an SD card slot is quicker, convenient, and lets me keep one USB-C port free for other stuff like charging camera batteries or my phone. Speaking of USB-C, there are 3 USB-C ports on this new MacBook Pro, although if I have a small gripe, 4 of them on my i9 was nice. Modern MacBook Pros are powerful enough to charge a variety of accessories, and having an additional USB-C port is something I rely on often. Not a deal breaker, but if we're making the MacBook Pro thicker, it would have been nice if Apple could have squeezed in a 4th port. We've also got HDMI back. It's not the fastest HDMI port, but when I travel and occasionally at home, I stream from my MacBook to a TV to watch shows, movies, and other YouTubers. Having the HDMI port built in is one less dongle to worry about. And the headphone jack is still there, thankfully, and has been returned to the left side of the MacBook Pro after a few years moonlighting on the right side. Now, all of these ports coming back is a great thing. It's a good thing, but it's not going to completely free you from dongle life. Like I mentioned, I shoot a lot of video, and even though I'm using an M1 Pro with 2 terabytes of storage, that's nowhere near what I need to save video files. I always travel with multiple portable hard drives, which always means carrying a multi-port dongle like this one, because unfortunately Apple didn't include any USB 3 ports in the M1 MacBook Pro. It might be a bit old school, but it's still a port a lot of us are still using. Another change to the physical design are the pads the MacBook Pro rests on. They're flat, which will spread out the contact they have with your desk or table, potentially giving them longer life. Aesthetically, it looks better in my view, but it also gives the MacBook Pro a nice amount of space for heat dissipation. Overall, the physical changes, coming from a 2019 i9 with 4 Thunderbolt ports, which I had just started getting used to, all the changes in the new M1 MacBook Pros are really welcome. It's nice having some of these ports back, especially the SD card slot, and since these machines are really made for video editing, that seems to be where the higher end of these machines are designed for, it was really kind of odd that Apple just took out the SD card slot in the first place, but either way, it's back now, and that is a good thing. So yes, the new M1 MacBook Pros are thicker and heavier, but I think a lot of us would agree that having a thicker and bigger laptop is okay for the trade-off of getting all the ports back, getting MagSafe back, and having a larger screen. And I think for a lot of devices, like our phones even, we would make that trade-off, a slightly thicker device, if we could get more battery life out of it, for example. So all of these design changes, even though this isn't the sleekest and slimmest MacBook Pro, I don't think that was an issue with the MacBook Pro in the first place. I think all of those things have been resolved, and I think the response that we are really happy and excited to see these ports back shows that we don't necessarily want or always need the slimmest and smallest device possible. Now, before we get to that larger screen, I just want to take a moment to make a eulogy for the Touch Bar. RIP, a feature most people hated, but just as I was getting used to it, realized its limitations were based on human physiology. Without tactile feedback, you had to look down at the touch bar and as a result, take your eyes off the screen. For all of its tricks, the touch bar was limited, so physical keys are back. No more accidentally turning your screen brightness up or down because your fingers got close to the touch bar or accidentally opening up Launchpad. The only thing I used to use the touch bar for on a regular basis was toggling between languages, but that's easy enough to do from the menu bar. Overall, bringing the physical keys back and getting rid of the touch bar is an improvement on the physical design of the M1 MacBook Pro over previous generations. Oh, and the fingerprint scanner is faster than ever, and this larger, slightly indented key is easier to reach, and again, the tactile feedback is more user-friendly. All right, let's talk about the screen and get one thing out of the way. The one thing you can't really get out of the way, and that's this notch. Oh, by the way, speaking of that notch, which houses a new 1080p webcam, which is upgraded from previous generations, I'm recording this on that camera, and I'm also using, for this part, the microphones that are in the M1 MacBook Pro, just to give you an idea of what it looks like and what it sounds like. On these M1 MacBook Pro, Apple have cut out a piece of the screen to fit in an upgraded 1080p webcam and ambient light sensors. You are getting more screen. The bezels are thinner all around, and instead of having a thicker top bezel, Apple simply brought the screen up and around the camera housing. More screen is better, and if you're looking at a MacBook Pro 16-inch especially, I'm gonna guess you're gonna appreciate those extra pixels. It's about trade-offs, and it's a trade-off I can live with. More screen for a notch, but the implementation is still a bit janky. See, the split in half menu bar seems only to be able to handle a certain number of app icons. A few too many and they simply disappear. If you're like me and use iStat to monitor your CPU usage and run multiple apps and like the convenience of being able to check in on them on the menu bar, this will be frustrating. Ideally, I'd like to be able to see all my menu icons up there on the menu bar or scroll through them or be able to click and go through various pages, but it's not there and it's kind of a bummer. Hopefully Apple will fix that in an upcoming software update. For now, there is the Bartender app, which gives you a lot more control over your menu bar, but it needs screen recording permissions, which is a little bit weird to me. macOS 12.1 was supposed to resolve some of these issues with menu bar icons disappearing, but they still disappear, so it seems like Apple still has a little bit of work to do. Now, overall, the keyboard, I love the keyboard. I love the way the keyboard looks with the new black background, and the keys seem clickier than previous generations. So even if you're coming from like a 2019 where they got rid of the butterfly keyboards and now they're a little clickier, these are even clickier. It feels even slightly more clicky keyboard, which is really nice to type on. And I've noticed that coming from the 2019 that I enjoy typing on this new M1 MacBook Pro a lot more than I did in 2019. Apple's also kept the larger trackpad, again, a good thing. We've gone backwards in terms of physical design, but when it comes to the internals, make no mistake, this is a huge, huge leap forward. I want to talk about these various spec updates because there are a couple different versions of this MacBook, and when you're putting together your own MacBook Pro, what those different tiers mean, which upgrades might be worth it, which might not be worth it, and of course, factoring in your budget. I want to break all of those things down for you. So here's what you need to know about configuring your own M1 MacBook Pro based on video editing, based on development, based on using virtual machines, those three areas, and as well as for general use, because there are pain points in each of those three areas. I've been using and testing the M1 Pro 32GB version, comparing it to a 32GB 2.3 GHz i9 with an 8GB AMD graphics card for the past few weeks. Those are similar spec levels from 2019 to this 2021 MacBook Pro, except the graphics. On the i9, it was a graphics spec bump. On the M1 Pro, it's the base level graphics. And in my daily workflow using virtual machines, developing apps, editing videos in Final Cut, I didn't really notice a huge difference between the i9 and the M1 Pro, based on what they could handle. I did notice a major difference in how loud they were, though. The i9 sounds like a rocket ship when it's rendering a video. The fans just kick up and it's really, really loud. It sounds like this. And it's also a lot hotter. Obviously, the fans are kicking on. When you compare the temperatures between the M1 Pro and the i9, it's just night and day. So if you tend to use your laptop on your lap a lot, especially when you're traveling, the i9 would get really hot. I would have to have something between my lap and the laptop. Whereas on the M1 Pro, like, it's just such a cool machine. Fans hardly ever kick on when I'm rendering or doing anything that's really processor intensive. It takes a lot to have the fans kick on. So what does all of this mean? First, if you're using an i9 MacBook Pro, you don't have to upgrade. In other words, if you're not running up against any performance limits, you could save your money and wait a bit longer for the M2 chips we're already hearing rumors about. You can still trade in your Intel MacBook Pro with Apple, and they probably won't lose a ton of value over the next year. For example, video rendering times. There's been a lot of talk about video rendering with these machines. In my workflow of editing 4K videos like this one in H.264 and exporting them, so we're talking videos that are like 10, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, I didn't notice a huge difference between the render times, and in fact, my i9 would render the videos faster than the M1 MacBook Pro did. It wasn't a huge difference, but the i9 would render faster, and maybe that will change with software updates as Apple optimizes Final Cut more and more and all the plugins get optimized for M1. But for now, the difference in my workflow, and I would suspect for most of your workflows, isn't going to be that huge. Unless you're rendering like 2-hour like actual movies or using 8K or 6K footage, you probably aren't going to notice the difference that much. When it comes to working in the timeline, when it comes to clipping videos and adding LUTs and color correcting and all of that stuff, both of these machines were able to handle my workflow completely fine. I didn't have any hiccups, no stuttering, no lag, nothing like that. So I wasn't hitting any performance limits with either of these two machines. In fact, with M1, I did notice that it had trouble rendering waveforms. So I'm guessing, again, this is another software issue that just has to be updated. So when it comes to pain points, you got to know that M1 is a new technology and there are still some things that haven't completely been worked out. And that's something you should be aware of when moving from an Intel machine to an M1. There are 3 kinds of apps: those that aren't designed to run on M1, those that have a separate M1 version, and those that have a single version that works with both M1 and Intel architecture. There are a few sites that try to list all the applications and what they're compatible with and not compatible with, but just know that transferring over from an Intel MacBook to an M1 MacBook isn't going to be entirely seamless. You will run into some issues. Apple's native apps should all run fine, but like I mentioned with Final Cut, there are still some kinks that need to be worked out. And when it comes to development, things like Firebase don't completely work on M1 architecture, which is its own kind of personal nightmare if you use Firebase in any of your code bases. And when it comes to virtual machines, there are other pain points to know about. You'll have to recreate all of your virtual machines because any Windows or Linux VMs you have running simply won't work. But if you are going to use virtual machines, the M1 optimized Parallels is blazingly faster than any of the other M1 options like VMware, and it should be your first choice. Updates, updates, updates. You are going to have to update a lot of your applications, either by grabbing the M1 version or just updating it through the app itself. Apple apps should be pretty zippy. You should notice that they are pretty fast and well optimized for M1, but for everything else, there's Rosetta. Rosetta is basically a translation engine which works seamlessly behind the scenes to allow your Intel apps to run on M1. It won't work for all applications, but a lot of them. Now, you won't get the optimization you get with M1, but at least your application will work, and hopefully your developer will update that app to work with M1 natively, hopefully not too far off in the future. Now, which M1 chip should you get? There are a lot of videos out there that break down all the various options, but if I'm going to give you a rule of thumb, it's this. If you know you need 32 gigabytes of memory, then it makes sense to spend an extra $200 and get the M1 Max 24-core GPU chip. The reason I say this is because if you get an M1 Pro with 16 gigs and you want to go then up to the next M1 24-core M1 Max, you need 32 gigabytes. You can't get a 16 gigabyte version M1 Max. See, you can only get the M1 Max 24-core chip and the 32-core chip with a minimum of 32 gigabytes of RAM. If you only need 16 gigabytes, you can't get an M1 Max chip with 16 gigabytes of memory. You can only get the Pro chip with 16 gigs. If you know you're getting 32 gigs extra, which is a $400 spec bump, then it makes a lot of sense to upgrade $200 more from there and get the M1 Max chip, which when it comes to the general price of these machines, which is now, we're talking close to like $3,000, that $200 isn't a huge jump. It's not a huge percentage of the price. It's like a 5% jump, but it makes a lot of sense. Here's why. Not only do you get 8 more graphic cores, but it also doubles the memory bandwidth from 200 gigabytes per second to 400. That means the CPU cores will be able to transfer more information back and forth from that added memory, which is an added performance boost you're likely to notice if you're running CPU-intensive tasks, like developing code editing audio, or running virtual machines. And that's the upgrade I ended up making. I didn't notice a huge difference between my i9 and the M1 Pro, and I figured the $200 extra was going to get me a major boost in performance. It also increases the resale value later down the line, and it makes this laptop more future-proof. Those added GPU cores and that memory bandwidth is really going to make a difference when it comes to developing apps and running virtual machines and editing audio and video. You're really going to get the most bang for your buck with that $200 upgrade from the Pro to the Max if you know you need 32 gigabytes of memory. Now, yes, there is a battery hit when it comes to M1 Pro versus the Max. It seems like those extra GPU cores use more energy, even when those extra GPU cores aren't actively in use. But I've got news for you. The battery life in these two machines is great, the Pro and the Max. When you're doing things like web browsing, you can easily get like 8 to 10 hours on a single charge. When you start doing some actual heavy lifting, like editing videos or doing any kind of real intensive work, that battery life is going to be closer to around 5 hours. Which isn't great, but don't let Apple's specs of 21 hours fool you, which are done under optimal conditions with the screen turned down all the way. You're going to get about real 5 hours. Like if you're video editing, you're going to get 5 hours of battery life tops using this machine. And the difference between the Pro and the Max battery life isn't huge. It's noticeable, I'd say like 10%. Chances are if you're getting a 16-inch MacBook Pro, it's going to be on your desk a lot of the time. The only time that I really rely on the battery life to get work done is when I'm on a layover at an airport and I need a couple hours to get a few things done, but I'm not going to be relying on the battery life for huge chunks of my workflow. I'm guessing if you're getting a MacBook Pro, that'll be very similar to you. You're going to be using this mainly at a desk, and if you are traveling or you're using this on battery life at a cafe, you're probably not going to be ever too far away from an outlet. So is it worth upgrading? Well, there are a few things to consider if you're thinking of upgrading to an M1 Pro or Max MacBook Pro. If you're coming from a MacBook Pro that's 3 to 4 years old or older, this is going to be a massive upgrade, and you will notice it in almost every single way from daily use, battery life, and screen real estate. If you're on a newer MacBook Pro, especially one that's higher end of the specs, the performance differences are likely to be less noticeable. Now, if you're currently pushing the limits of the machine you have now, then an upgrade would make sense. This is going to be an upgrade for you. If you're not really pushing those limits, then you can probably hold off and wait for the M2, which we're already hearing rumors about. And the M1 architecture, remember, is at its initial stages. So each iteration from here is going to be a big leap, and then we're going to sort of see that round off in years to come. But for now, every difference between the M1 and then M1 Pro and then the M1 Max and then the M1 and M3, those are all going to be bigger and bigger leaps. So you do benefit a bit from waiting to upgrade. As for trade-in values on Intels, this is a really good time because a lot of people are ditching their Intel machines for a new M1, which can take a chunk out of the upgrade cost. But there's always a good used market for MacBook Pros, so if you save the money now, you can get a better machine when the time comes. Intel updates are going to be supported for years to come, and M1 is just getting started. If you're still watching at this point and you have the money and you really want to upgrade, you're not going to regret getting an M1 MacBook Pro or Max. On the other hand, if you stick with your 1 to 2 year old MacBook Pro, you're not going to notice what you're missing, save a few $1,000s, and then upgrade when an even bigger, better, faster version is available. And if you are upgrading to an M1 MacBook Pro, remember, if you're getting at least 32 gigabytes of memory, make sure you get the M1 Max with 24-core GPU. You could get the higher version of that or get more memory, but if you're getting the 32 gigabyte version, don't get the M1 Pro if your budget can handle it. If you're on a tight budget, you won't probably be missing anything, but if you want the most bang for your buck, spend that extra $200 and get the M1 Max 24-core with that 32 gigabytes of memory if you know you need 32 gigabytes of memory. I hope this video helps you make that purchase decision between the Intel Max, the M1 Max, the M1 Pro, all of those things. I did a lot of research and I just went crazy trying to figure out the differences between all of these. I'm guessing a lot of you are in that situation as well. It is a little bit confusing, and I blame Apple a little bit here, giving the name Pro and Max and not clearly differentiating what the differences are and kind of making it seem like the Pro is just like a regular old machine and then the Max is the one that you need. But these are really high-end laptops. You're not going to be you're not going in the slow lane by getting the M1 Pro over the Max. The differences aren't massive. The differences aren't massive because these are really high-level machines, and they're really going to be able to help most people's workflows. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be hanging out down in the comments section. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe buttons. I'll have new videos for you every week, and I will see you in the next video.